Welcome to the Psychology World podcast with me, Connor Whiteley, psychology student and international best-selling psychology author of over 30 psychology books, bringing you the latest psychology news, fascinating psychology topics and more each week. If you want to learn more, then please check out connorwhiteley.net/books. And don't forget to like and subscribe to the YouTube video or follow on your favourite podcast app. And here's the show. Hi everyone, and welcome to episode 355 of the Psychology World podcast with me, Colin Whiteley. And today's episode is on why do people enjoy true crime? And it is Sunday, the 23rd of November 2025 as I record this. So today's podcast episode is a lot of fun, it's really insightful, and we're returning to forensic psychology, which is one of my favourite areas of psychology after clinical psychology. Not only because I tend to find that criminal behaviour is absolutely fascinating, but also there's a lot of overlap between clinical psychology and forensic psychology, which is why the rule of thumb is if you sort of want to work in forensic psychology, it's best to do the clinical route first of all, just so you become a fully qualified clinical psychologist. Because if you go into prisons and realize, oh my god, I absolutely hate working in like a prison settings, then you can go into a wide range of other settings too. Whereas if you only become a fully qualified forensic psychologist, you are sort of stuck in a applied settings. But going back to what today's podcast episode is actually about. So you're going to learn some absolutely fascinating topics, like why do people enjoy true crime? How do personality factors make people enjoy true crime more? Also, what are the different social factors, mental health factors that mean that people are able to enjoy true crime? And there's some really surprising findings in today's podcast episode that I was really surprised about. For example, engaging in true crime content can actually lower your anxiety, but then in other contexts, it can increase your anxiety. So you've got lots of fascinating facts like that coming up in the content parts of today's episode. So moving on to the psychology news section, we've reading from the British Psychological Society Research Digest, and the first one is very interesting and very up my street. Non-binary insights slip through the cracks in sexuality research. Over the past decade, research into the sexuality of gender non-conforming people has grown rapidly. Despite this increased interest, however, those who identify as non-binary often remain underrepresented within broader research on gender and sexuality. This poses a problem not only for non-binary people and their partners in terms of being more widely understood, but also for professionals seeking to update the knowledge and provide support, who may be left with little peer-reviewed information to draw on. To assess the size of this research gap, a team from the University of Southampton drew on 12 years' worth of papers on non-binary people's sexuality. Writing in the archives of sexual behaviour, they present a rounded image of what has been investigated so far and found that non-binary people have some things in common with their binary transgender peers, but the measures used in the research often fail to fully capture their experiences. So personally, this is something I'm very interested in as a non-binary person myself, but also because this comes back to the 4 studies that I ran during my masters, and I definitely agree for the most part that non-binary people in research is basically non-existent. You can find quite a lot of research on transgender people, but even that, there's some areas of the transgender experience or the transgender journey which is not covered at all. which is why I was going to do one of my research papers. Because I've left university now and other bits and pieces, the likelihood of that getting published is very, very slim. But I might turn it into a book at some point. And this is why when I did my transgender research, I really did want to focus on the qualitative aspects for research, just so I could capture the nuances of binary transgender people, so trans men and trans women, but I could also capture the experiences and the nuance of the non-binary experience too. And the research was a lot of fun. It was really engaging, and I flat out loved it. And drawing upon my own research findings, I would definitely say that there are some similarities between the transgender umbrella overall, because non-binary people definitely have quite a few things in common with their binary transgender peers. But there are a lot of nuances which, unless you start researching it, unless you start digging in to it, you're never going to know that these are things. There's something that I found during my dissertation project was that when it comes to gender affirming clothing, for binary trans people, it is a pretty clear yes that wearing gender affirming clothing does improve their mental health. But for non-binary people, the answers are a lot more mixed, because there's no such thing really as non-binary clothing or a non-binary style to some extent. So there's a lot of interesting facts, and I think that the applied finding here would be that whenever we're supporting a minority, I think it's really important that we do try and research, understand, and most importantly, publish all of our data, just so that we can understand and try and push our knowledge forward about gender, ethnic, and sexuality minorities, just so that professionals can update their knowledge and provide support, and they have more peer-reviewed information to draw on. So just something to think about. So the second one is pandemic spiked OCD symptoms. During the acute phase of the COVID-19 pandemic, fears of infection and a hyper-focus on hygiene were widespread. It's perhaps not surprising then that increased public health measures were accompanied by rising symptoms of excessive compulsive disorder, which is characterized by the presence of intrusive thoughts and obsessions, as well as compulsive behaviors to reduce the stress. Symptoms that relate to contamination, such as compulsive hand washing, showed a particular increase. But has there been a longer term impact on the population? Could the pandemic even be responsible for the tripling in number of British 16 to 24-year-olds reporting obsessive compulsive symptoms? For example, a 4-year study charting obsessive compulsive symptoms in the general population since the start of the pandemic has found a sharp increase that has since waned. So this is a really good study to actually focus on, first of all, because when I was reading this, my mind immediately went to the social cultural contexts that mental health symptoms and mental health conditions are developing. Because if we think about it, the traditional, I say in air quotes, symptoms of obsessive compulsive disorder is the presence of intrusive thoughts and obsessions and compulsive behaviors used to reduce stress. Now, during the pandemic, the vast majority of us were terrified of getting COVID, spreading it to our loved ones, and harming ourselves and our family. None of us wanted to die during the pandemic. So, a lot of us were quite stressed about that. Okay, so you've got that stress, but then you've got the hand washing, the public health measures, and you really wanting to remain clean. And all of us had these habits to reduce this stress, also known as this fear of dying, getting COVID, and a whole bunch of other negative outcomes, so none of us wanted that. And all of us were really into hand washing, keeping our distance, and we were all very aware of infections. All of us were very preoccupied with hygiene. So if that happened during a non-pandemic, we would probably say this person has to have OCD. In addition, if it was a cause in them to having impaired a functioning, like how they relate to work, their social relationships were breaking down, and a whole bunch of other facets. But during a pandemic, all of these OCD behaviors, or behaviors we would typically associate with OCD, were more socially acceptable because everyone was doing it, and there was a clear reason, especially during the acute phase of the pandemic. And we aren't going to instantly diagnose most of the population, if not the entire population, with OCD because they're scared of a very real virus. So that's the one thing, and that's one example of how social or cultural context that can influence mental health diagnoses. Also, something to bear in mind here is that OCD and other mental health conditions can be related to social norms. This is one of the reasons why the diagnostic criteria isn't as great as everyone says it is. Because going back to the pandemic, having OCD like symptoms, well, that's very plausible, it's very understandable, and it's the norm. All of us were washing our hands, all of us were being hyper focused on hygiene, and all of us had intrusive thoughts and sessions about not wanting to get a COVID. So it's a social norm. And because we're 4 years on from the pandemic, or to be honest, 5 years now, since at the start, well, with the hyper focus on like hygiene, the fears of infection, amongst the other habits which we know all were too well from the pandemic, those have mostly gone away. So it's no longer the social norm to be as paranoid or focused on hygiene, which is one of the reasons why this sharp increase has since waned. So the main takeaways from this Psychology News article is simply the fact that it's a good example how mental health diagnoses can have a consequence of their time, of the social norms, and the social cultural context that we live in. It's just some food for thought. So the last one is, are we ready to provide support in assisted dying? Psychologists are amongst the many health professionals who may be involved in the assisted dying process, but despite the importance of psychological support when it comes to death and dying, a new study published in Omega Journal of Death and Dying suggests that in Australia, where voluntary assisted dying is already illegal, psychologists face significant barriers to providing support despite being well positioned to play a role. This research explores how early career psychologists fail to engage in the assisted dying practice, and as the UK approaches the potential legalisation of assisted dying, highlights both the barriers and opportunities that psychologists on this side of the globe may encounter. So, personally, all I'm going to say is that I'm a supporter of a assisted dying, mainly because I have two members of my family who assisted dying would have been so beneficial for, because they themselves died like about like 6 months to a year before they actually died, and all I could see was the pain. All I could see to my family was how much this suffering was just being dragged on, and just seeing my family members, the people who ended up dead sadly, just seeing them in so much pain was awful. And it would have been so much nicer for all of us if we could simply do the assisted dying, just so that the people who were chronically ill didn't have to go through all of that pain, and our suffering and our pain as the family could have been stopped to some extent sooner, just so that we could start healing and recovering, and we could just bury the family member who had already been dead for months, if not years, before their physical demise. So that's my perspective, first of all. But I also just want to say that this irritates me because psychologists are the best people placed to support the mental health of the people who are either going through assisted dying or the friends and family members of that person who has decided to make that choice. Now, I think one of the reasons why we are not involved in assisted dying in practice is because assisted dying is a very medical procedure. Therefore, only medical professionals like to be involved in physical processes though, because during my job hunt, I looked at so many different psychology careers, and there were so few psychological professionals in physical health settings, even though a cancer diagnosis has massive psychological implications for the person with a cancer and the friends and family and social support network around them. They need psychological support, but because cancer and other physical conditions are medical conditions and not mental health conditions, no one wants to let psychologists near it. So this is definitely something that we're going to have to tackle, especially if the UK does legalise assisted dying. I think there are definitely a lot of barriers and opportunities that we need to think about. And I might do a podcast episode on this in the future. So I think it's something we need to be aware of, for sure. So I hope you enjoyed the psychology news section. So let's move on to the personal update. So moving on to the personal update. This week has been absolutely brilliant and it's been a lot of fun. One of the reasons for this is because I graduated from the University of Kent on a Friday, and it was a brilliant ceremony. It was really cold. None of us could believe quite how cold it was, and it was a bit painful. All of us were quite worried in Canterbury Cathedral about how cold it was going to be. Thankfully, it wasn't as freezing cold as I thought it was going to be, but the ceremony itself was brilliant, and all of us said it was so much better than the undergraduate ceremony. Not only because it felt a lot shorter and there were no boring speeches, but also because I've already done it once, I wasn't anxious, I was just looking forward to it, and I was able to see so many brilliant friends again, and people I've seen from my masters and my university. And when it came to the reception, my mum was almost crying. Not so much because the fact that I've got a master's, which she was also very emotional about, but also because I was talking to so many people, which was a massive contrast to my undergraduate graduation reception, which I didn't really talk to anyone, because I didn't really know anyone. And that's what was so lovely about my master's graduation reception. I spent the whole hour, well, hour and a half really, talking to so many different bits and people, catching up, seeing like what they were up to, and just like socializing, catching up with with different lecturers and so many other great people. I've definitely got some stories to tell from what's currently going on at the university, but it was just a lovely day that I flat out loved. And I'm so grateful that I was able to graduate, considering everything that I've been through. And I'm so glad that I've grown in more confidence and more social, and I'm really able to connect with other people more though, because that's something that I'm really proud about, and just proud about how much I've changed since my undergraduate graduation 2 years ago. So, besides from that, I've also been at a work this week. Lots of different things happened, but there's nothing that I can really talk about because none of it's too psychology related. But something else that I have been doing this week is there will be changes coming to this podcast. Just because my time is so limited at the moment, all between full-time work, me being a fiction writer, psychology author, psychology podcaster, and everything else that I do, I really do need to make a few changes. So, from now on, I am going to have to batch psychology podcast episodes. So, this week I've been writing four podcast episodes that will be coming out over the next 4 weeks. So, you've got today's podcast episode called Wise People Enjoy True Crime. Another podcast episode is going to be on global perspectives on learning disabilities, which is flat out critical for my work and it's really informative. Another one is going to be on adoption, and then the one that I'm currently writing up is going to be on career changes and career transitions. So all of those are going to be fascinating, really in-depth podcast episodes. And something that I like about batching these podcast episodes is that it allows me to go into more depth, not only on the topic itself, but how does this apply to aspiring qualified psychologists, but also other mental health professionals, as you as an individual. And I really do bring these topics alive. So I really am looking forward to it. So another change that is coming to the podcast is that the content part of these podcast episodes will no longer be recorded by me in my human voice. Instead, the content part of today's episode is going to be generated using my AI voice clone, because basically, when it comes to the recording the content part of today's podcast episode, that tends to take me about 20 minutes, and then to edit it takes me between another 20 minutes to half an hour to sometimes 40 minutes, depending on how long the podcast episode is. I just do not have that sort of time anymore. And part of me thinks that it's heartbreaking, but to be honest, if I don't do that, if I don't make some small changes, then something has to go. And chances are, at some point, this podcast will no longer be sustainable for me. And that would kill me inside. Because I love this podcast, I love learning, and I love all of you wonderful listeners. So this is my best compromise at the moment. And so far, I think this is going to be really, really good and sustainable for the long term. So, as always, I always love to hear your thoughts and feelings on today's episode. So, you can always email me, connorwhiteley@connorwhiteley.net. You can always leave a comment at the show notes at connorwhiteley.net/podcast. And you can always tweet on Twitter at sci-fi whiteley. I always love to hear from all of you because it really helps make the podcast feel more like a conversation. And please feel free to send pictures of where you're listening from. I always love to see where all of you are, all over the world. So today's podcast episode has been sponsored by Criminal Profiling, a forensic and criminal psychology guide to FBI and statistical profiling. So this is one of my most popular books ever. I'm always surprised at how much this book sells, because criminal profiling is such a false topic, and people think that forensic psychology is a criminal profiling, but it couldn't be further from the truth. So this great, engaging, really easy to understand book that people flat out love actually tells you what is the truth about FBI profiling and what is statistical profiling. Because FBI profiling is flat out rubbish. It actually impedes in investigations more than it helps, and it has very checkered history because criminal profiling is not science in the slightest. But statistical profiling is slightly better, it might be more commonplace, and it can actually help in investigations to some extent. So if you want a gripping, engaging, and fascinating book, then please check out Criminal Profiling, a forensic and criminal psychology guide to FBI and statistical profiling. Available from all major ebook retailers, and you can order the paperback and the hardback version from Amazon, your local bookstore, or local library if you request it. And you can get the audiobook narrated by artificial intelligence from selected audiobook retailers like Spotify, Kobo, Google Play, and Barnes & Noble, and selected library systems too, like Overdrive and Biblioteca. So whilst buying books helps to support the creation and the editing of the podcast, my time is sponsored by my wonderful patrons. And as always, a massive thank you to my patrons, because your support shows that you like the show and you want to continue. So if you want to become a patron of the show and get access to tons of great rewards, now you can at patreon.com/the Psychology World podcast. Or if you want to support the podcast on a one-off basis, then now you can at buymeacoffee.com/Conor Wiley. So that's enough for the personal update. Let's move on to the content part of today's episode. So moving on to the content part of today's episode. So we're going to be talking about why do people enjoy true crime. This is a brilliant podcast episode, and I know that you're going to learn a lot about it. So let's dive into it, and the content part of today's episode will be read out using my AI voice clone. Enjoy. Why are people obsessed with true crime? In addition to the 2024 survey, where Ainvest found that the global true crime podcast audience is worth over $3 billion, and the podcast genre has experienced a major weekly increase of 20% since 2020. True crime podcasting is the largest genre across a wide range of platforms, as well as it is a very popular book genre, with multiple true crime books being international bestsellers. Personally, I don't enjoy true crime. If you enjoy reading or listening about murder, sexual violence, and other types of crimes in your free time, then more power to you. And I want to take a moment to remind all of us that it's okay that we all have different hobbies and interests. I love anime, listening to writing podcasts, and watching writing videos in my spare time, as well as psychology podcasts and more. Some of you won't have the same interests as me, and that's okay. If you enjoy true crime podcasts, then I'm happy for you. Personally, the reason why I don't enjoy them is because I prefer fictional crimes compared to knowing exactly how dark people can be in the real world. And I have seen and experienced enough darkness, trauma, and abuse over the years. I don't need to be reminded of the real world. I want to escape into fictional worlds, even when they are crime dramas. Yet there are plenty of people that love the true crime genre. Originally, this seems counterintuitive because we have a basic instinct to survive, protect ourselves, and protect our relatives. Although learning about murder, kidnappings, and other crimes might increase our anxiety, our positive view of the world, and possibly our communities. You might think it's a good idea to actively avoid true crime entertainment. Nonetheless, as I always say, psychology is not common sense. Therefore, in the rest of this psychology podcast episode, we'll learn why people enjoy true crime based on the 5 reasons uncovered in a survey by Perchtolds, Stefan et al., 2025. Why is true crime a coping mechanism? At first, I thought the idea of people using true crime podcasts and media as a coping mechanism was strange, but I realized that people just want to cope, survive, and protect their mental health at the end of the day. This can be seen across a wide range of mental health conditions, so whilst there is no relationship between true crime consumption and mental health conditions, it is a useful reminder that as aspiring or qualified psychologists, that we shouldn't judge others because of their coping mechanisms. Then again, we must ensure that our personal coping mechanisms are healthy, adaptive, and they have a lot more benefits than negatives. Therefore, some people decide to engage in a true crime entertainment because they want to learn how to engage in a cognitive reframing of a bad situation. For example, getting kidnapped, robbed, or mugged. Since true crime allows us to learn from the experience of other people. In addition, these people are more likely to acknowledge the emotions that true crime brings up without judgment, engage in problem solving behavior, accurately label their distressing emotions, as well as practice mindful behaviors. For instance, staying present in an unpleasant emotional state. In my experience, this reminds me of something I did during the 7 months after my rape when my own mental health was very severe. I occasionally engaged in rape related content so I could learn from others, and it was helpful to some extent to see how others dealt with their emotions, their PTSD, and other negative mental health outcomes. How does true crime lower anxiety? This is definitely something I didn't think would be a benefit of engaging with true crime. This is another example of a psychology not being common sense. I firmly believed that true crime media would increase our anxiety, but it can actually lower it. As a result of, similar to how you get less anxious the more you practice for a driving test, a job interview, or subsequent dates with the same person, exposing yourself to true crime can help you feel ready for an important event. Since this sense of preparedness that true crime media provides people is called defensive vigilance. This means that a person aims to remain prepared, calm, as well as responsive to the potential threat of others around them. Again, at first you might think that this defensive vigilance would make people feel constantly on edge, tense, and unsafe going about their normal life because they know what other people are capable of because of true crime content. Yet in reality, there is evidence that suggests true crime consumption can actually reduce a person's anxiety about possible fears of the outside world. Due to true crime consumption, gives a person the illusion of being more prepared for the threat of a real life attack. Of course, we don't know if true crime consumption actually makes a person better prepared to defend themselves from the threat of a possible crime, but the ability to stay calm in a frightening situation is highly recommended. In my opinion, I would add that crime drama consumption at the very least. I understand this is different to true crime consumption, but I think there are parallels. Does not prepare you for crimes as much as you might believe. For example, while sexual violence isn't a very common topic on crime dramas, yes, I'm ignoring Law and Order, Special Victims Unit, the crime is still covered on different crime dramas from time to time. The survivors' stories are told, their actions and the investigation around the crime reveal more details. I watched them, I enjoyed the programs, and yet it did not prepare me in the slightest for my own rape in 2024, just my 2 pence. How does true crime consumption distort our worldview? On the other hand, for other people, engaging in true crime content leads them to think that there's an increased risk of them becoming victims of crimes, since the more afraid you are of something, the more likely you are to believe that this will actually happen to you. For example, let's say that you recently watched a true crime podcast episode on a mugging that ended in a homicide, and you believe because of various factors, like your neighborhood, that you or your partner are likely to be mugged. Whether this is based on rational thinking doesn't matter at the moment. You're likely to be afraid that your partner and yourself are likely to be mugged, but you're also going to engage in various safety behaviors to protect yourself. When in reality, all these safety behaviors are doing is reinforcing your fear and anxiety about being mugged. Ultimately, often our fears create our beliefs of the facts. How is true crime consumption linked to aggression and disagreeableness? Interestingly, if we step into personality psychology for a moment, it turns out that people who consume true crime media are more likely to score higher on measures of disagreeableness as well as aggression, since disagreeable people tend to reflect lower levels of empathy and higher levels of hostility towards others. Therefore, disagreeable people are more confrontational and they can appear less concerned with the well being of others. As well as aggressive people tend to view all situations through a lens of violence or anger, so they tend to be more interested in a confrontational or violent content. Furthermore, I'll build upon this in more depth in a moment, but when I researched the above paragraph, my mind immediately went towards the realization that people high in empathy would struggle to watch true crime content. I imagine myself as a person with an average level of empathy, but honestly, I hate the idea knowing that real people had to experience these horrible, foul, and twisted crimes. I think it's outrageous that offenders inflicted these sort of illegal behaviours on others. Therefore, if a person had a higher level of empathy, I hate to imagine the sort of emotional pain that they would experience watching true crime content. As a result, when it comes to engaging in true crime content, it's healthy and recommended to maintain a healthy amount of denial and distancing. This is why a person's own levels of aggressive impulses and hostility can help or harm their mental health when engaging in this acquired taste of media. How is true crime consumption impacted by gender? There is a very clear gender split when it comes to true crime consumption, because women make up the vast majority of the audience. This is even more true when it comes to consuming true crime podcasts. This is because women tend to engage more in a true crime because it helps them to regulate their emotions as well as it makes them feel safe in an unpredictable world. My nan was a brilliant example of a woman who loved true crime. She used to watch all the murder, kidnapping, and all sorts of other true crime programs on TV. I remember going to her house as a child and we were looking through her recordings once, and she had pages upon pages of true crime programs. To say she was obsessed, I think would actually be fair. She didn't go to a club, talk to anyone about true crime, and she didn't read lots of true crime books, but she did love her programs. Furthermore, the very fact that women are using true crime to regulate their emotions and provide a feeling of safety is even more tragic and heartbreaking when we consider that women are likely than men to be victimized, and in the past few years, there has been great awareness raised about violence against women. You only need to look at sexual violence to see that the vast majority of her survivors are women. Therefore, it could be argued that true crime consumption could be a training exercise for women. So, if they are ever the victim of a crime, they know how to react. It's heartbreaking that in the 21st century this is even needed, and this is why it is important that we raise awareness, educate everyone, and we do not tolerate violence or crimes against anyone at all. Nonetheless, just because women make up the majority of the true crime audience, it doesn't mean that men do not engage in the genre at all. In fact, men who engage in a true crime content tend to have a higher income bracket. This might be because these men have more disposable income and, in turn, time for leisure activities. Another reason for this might be because men in higher income brackets might have more access to available sources. On the whole, the men and women who engage in a true crime content tend to do better with unexpected disappointments in their life, as well as they're better at overcoming fears of the unknown in situations that appear dangerous. Personally, I think this is a great benefit of true crime content because it teaches us that life is unexpected, things will sadly happen to you that you don't expect, and that's okay. It will not feel great, okay, or pleasant in the moment, and it might take you weeks, months, or years to recover, but you will be okay in the end. Being a victim of a crime can be traumatizing, and if all my trauma over the years has taught me anything, it is that if you take one day at a time, sometimes 1 minute at a time, and you keep moving forward with professional support to guide you, you can recover and you'll survive, heal, and thrive. Engaging in true crime content might help us with that. Conclusion. When I originally thought of doing a psychology podcast episode on true crime, I really didn't know what to expect because the world of true crime is so alien to me. Yet I have really enjoyed today's episode. We got to learn how true crime consumption lowers anxiety, distorts our worldview, provides people with a coping skill, has a gender divide, and how it is impacted by aggression and disagreeableness. It has been a lot of fun, and I think this podcast episode is a reminder that it's okay, it's fun, and it can be an absolute pleasure to explore topics that we would never ever normally engage in. On the whole, some people might see true crime content as a great chance to explore a niche world that hopefully very few of us will ever get to actually experience in our own lives, because hopefully very few of us will ever become victims or survivors of crimes. Yet if you are a reader or listener who enjoys true crime books, podcasts, or other forms of media, then this might be a great thing. And as I always say, you need to do what makes you happy, helps you to relax, and helps you practice self-care. If you enjoy true crime content, then more power to you. And whether you enjoy true crime or not, ask yourself a little question. Why do you enjoy it or not? Hi everyone, so this is Human Me again. So I really hope that you enjoyed today's episode and you got something out of it. Like I know that I did, because ever since we covered true crime fandom on the podcast about 2 or 3 weeks ago in a psychology news section, I really have just wanted to understand why. Why do people enjoy true crime? What are the personality factors? What are the mental health benefits? Or how does this impact their mental health? So there's a lot of fascinating ideas. And to be honest, the most surprising thing for me for this podcast episode was how engaging in true crime content can actually lower your anxiety, that I found fascinating and very, very surprising. And if you know anyone who would enjoy today's episode, then please share it with them. I'm always really grateful when you wonderful people help us spread the word about the podcast. And if you want to learn more, please check out Criminal Profiling, a forensic and criminal psychology guide to FBI and statistical profiling, available in all the usual places. And if you want to support the podcast on a monthly basis, then please head on over to patreon.com/the Psychology World podcast. And if you want to support the podcast on a one-off basis, then head on over to buymeacoffee.com/Connor Whiteley. And as always, I always love to hear your thoughts and feelings on today's episode, so do let me know. So have a great day everyone, and I'll see you next time. Found it helpful. Please remember to like the video and subscribe to the YouTube channel and follow the podcast on your favourite podcast app. And if you wanted to learn more, then please check out the backlist of the podcast episodes or my books at conwhiteley.net. next step. Have a great day, and I'll see you next time.